This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Here is another Beyond the Big Screen teaser for episodes coming soon. I hope you enjoy and definitely tune in for the full episodes. If you want to learn more, you can head over to beyondthebigscreen.com. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon and Subscribestar. By joining on Patreon and or Subscribestar, you can help keep Beyond the Big Screen going and get many great benefits. Benefits include advertisement-free content, bonus content, and early access. The bonus content is great too. I will feature outtakes from episodes and live streaming episodes. If you join at the executive producer level, you will become just that, an executive producer of Beyond the Big Screen. You will be able to develop ideas for upcoming episodes, help find great guests, and of course have your name mentioned at the beginning or end of each episode. You won't just be a supporter, you will be a critical member of the team. Go over to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen or subscribestar.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com, or follow us on social media by searching for A2Z History. I will see you next time Beyond the Big Screen.
Today, we have some bonus content featuring some random thoughts and ideas from talking with our very own Mustache, Chris. We hope you enjoy and let us know what you think.
And so you had all these different promotions that all had their all different tastes and flares inside, and they all kind of played within the NWA as a blanket organization. But then you had the lucha libre, the Mexican style of wrestling. And how did that fit in, and where did that come in on the evolution of wrestling and the history of wrestling up to this point?
Mexican wrestling was kind of its little own ecosystem to a degree. It kind of developed like on its own, right? A very unique, like high flying style. Most people are familiar with Mexican wrestling because of like the guys wearing the masks, right? And the high, like flying off the ropes and like doing crazy flips and high, like crazy spots and bumps and it's almost like more like gymnastics than like kind of like what we would consider like wrestling, right? You would get sometimes these guys would come to the States and they would like do a match here and there or whatever, and it was kind of done as like a special attraction. So it kind of developed in its own little ecosystem, really, right? And that's why it's so unique. That's why it's like when you watch like Mexican wrestling, it's very different than what we grew up watching, right? It's a little bit different now, especially in the 90s with the WCW was actually quite famous for bringing in a lot of these lucha libres and these cruiserweight type wrestlers and exposing them to a wider audience. And you just finished a book and it was about ECW, and they brought a lot of these guys in too, right? Because they wanted something different, right? But yeah, it kind of developed as its own thing down in Mexico.
And so that was kind of a similar story as what was happening in Japan, that they had developed their own style that would later become influential in American wrestling. But that's a little bit further down the road. But there are these different styles of wrestling that are all developing independently, but they're all going to come together at some point when we get to that style of wrestling in the 90s and in the early 2000s. But do you see that the WWE and the future of wrestling, because in a lot of ways you see these wrestlers and they're enormous, they're, muscles on top of muscles on top of muscles. Are they going to get back into a situation where they've just pushed these performers too far? And are we just going to see another cycle of drug abuse and just physically people falling apart.
I would, yeah, I especially in the indie scene. Um, there's this belief, and I guess I don't know if you want to necessarily blame the ECW for this, but there's this, it's high spot after high spot after high spot. So like they're constantly doing like these crazy moves and stuff off the top ropes, and it leads to all different types of injuries. And I would argue if you can those things, yes, you can do them, but I would argue that you don't have to be doing those types of moves all the time. Um, I would say like learn how to be able to tell a story in the ring better. But I don't think you're far off. Like, and these stories never stop, right? The Hardy brothers, who are more modern wrestlers, they've both gone through addiction to pain and pain pills and drug abuse and drinking and what have you. I mean, that was one of the reasons Jeff Hardy was kicked out of the WWE, because he was an addict and refused to go to rehab. I mean, that's one thing that WWE will tell you. That they've started doing is they'll pay for guys to go to rehab that ends up getting to that point. Vince gets a really bad rep for different types of reasons, but I'll say this, is he does try to do the right. He has been trying to do the right thing, especially in the last couple of years for a lot of these guys. Like he paid for Jake the Snake's Roberts rehab. He paid for Razor Ramon to get sober. A lot of these guys he does try to help. But
in the 80s, in that heyday of the WWF, it was really what Vince did that made WWF so successful. It seems like by this phase in the early 2000s, it's basically Vince was the last man standing out of all of this, and that the wrestling that was coming out of the WWF wasn't extraordinarily more entertaining than the wrestling that was coming out of the WCW. Yeah, there were some of the big names but they're really the big names because in retrospect, people like The Rock, who become superstars in acting and all these other things. At the time, I don't think that The Rock was head and shoulders above anybody else in, say, the WCW.
No, yeah, especially in comparison to like Goldberg and even Diamond Dallas Page, who was famous. He had a match with Jay Leno. I don't know, maybe your audiences will remember that Jay Leno was at a WCW show at one time. The Rock, he was a big star, I would say, but I mean, in terms of like who was the biggest star at that time, Stone Cold, hands down. In terms of just pure wrestling, Stone Cold was he's the only guy since you can compare to Hulk Hogan in terms of popularity, in my opinion. And to me, that was the last, like, kind of like I've pointed out earlier, like it's the last golden age of wrestling. Like you had like two big promotions, and like they all had their own stars. Like WCW had Goldberg, they had Sting, Ric Flair, Booker T, Diamond Dallas Page, and the WWF had like Triple H, Hulk Hogan. Sorry, not Hulk Hogan. Triple H, Mick Foley, The Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Undertaker, and it was a huge thing. And these were all household names. Now, if you compare it to fast forward to nowadays, I'd be hard pressed. I mean, people probably, they know The Rock did wrestling. People might know who John Cena is, but I'd be hard pressed, like, if you went into your average household and said, like, can you name any like modern wrestler that's like, big time? I bet you most people couldn't.
Yeah, it really does seem like it's left the realm of like the sophisticated wrestler audience, that it's really geared towards the kids, maybe the teens, but they're not. I mean, it just seems like they're getting bigger and bigger. It's like, almost, again, like cartoonish to the point today that I can't see that I would probably watch it.
There is some light at the end of the tunnel, though. Right now, there is a new promotion that came about in the last couple of years called AEW, All Elite Wrestling, and I've been watching some of their stuff because I stopped watching the WWE. For a while. I started watching a little bit again when Daniel Bryan was going on his title run, which was the closest thing I've ever felt to back in that time period of like the Stone Cold era, in terms of just like the the reactions from the crowd, and it was just like organic, and it was, you know, just a lot of fun. And the WWE kind of messed that all up. Daniel Bryan got hurt. It's a long story. I don't want to bore your audience with it. But this new promotion that has come around, is they've got some serious money back behind them too. And they're gearing their shows more so towards that 18 to 40 demographic that the WWF has pretty much seemingly given up on. They don't really care for, which is fine. You know, like they want to put on a show that's more for families. That's fine, but that's not for me as a wrestling fan. I want to see something different. Which was, to go back to what we were talking about, the territories, which was what made the territory system so great, is like, okay, well, I don't really like watching this. I can watch something else. Having competition in multiple different promotions. Like, okay, I don't like what the WWF's doing. I'm going to watch WCW, or I'm going to watch the AWA, or I'm going to watch ECW, or what have you, right? It's nice to have a rival promotion that's putting on something that's different than what the WWF is doing. And we haven't had that 20 years, 30 years. It's been a long time.
Okay, I'll ask it. I don't know if it might lead us astray. Do you think that in some ways that wrestling as a entertainment form for the 18 to 40 demographic has kind of been cut off a little bit because there is MMA that captures the athletic part of of what wrestling is trying to get, but you don't have to deal with like it's become pretty much cheesy entertainment.
I would definitely say that when MMA became popular, wrestling definitely it took a hit, right? Because it's like, well, here's like the thing, but it's real. Whereas like everyone knows that the WWE is fake. But my argument would be, start putting out better programming, right? Like, I don't necessarily see a direct competition between the two. I really don't. Like, I don't see, I don't know, like if you're going to watch a wrestling show, I watch both, right? So I'm like, well, I watch MMA because it's a fight. It's real. I watch wrestling because for something else, you know? It's the reason, in my opinion, that wrestling has gone down is because the product itself hasn't, especially the product that the WWE, in my opinion, has been putting out, just hasn't been very good. You know, and this is just my opinion. I think they should start going back to some of the more old school stuff that worked in wrestling before. Like, this is like wrestling jargon, but like keeping kayfabe is just staying in character, you know? So like, have these guys stay in character. Like, I get that the character's fake, but like if you play it long enough and you're out in public and you're playing the character, eventually you start becoming that person in the eyes of the viewing public. I understand that the individual is not that person, but you end up like becoming that person. Like a lot of wrestlers nowadays don't even bother trying to keep kayfabe. It's really bizarre to me.
Yeah, it really loses that aspect of theater that they could really capitalize on.
Yeah, because MMA does its thing and it's real or whatever, but they've gone, I don't know, they've gone away from a lot of the things that made like wrestling great, like even Stone Cold. And it wasn't like kayfabe was like a big part at that time period, but I mean, you grew up at that time. How often did you ever see Stone Cold not playing Stone Cold?
Yeah, he really did. He embraced that character. And I think that probably was something that made it more engaging, is that he carried that through.
Yeah. I thought it was like, this is like a Canadianism or what have you, but there's a TV show up in Canada. It's called Trailer Park Boys, right? And it's got these three characters or whatever. It's like a comedy show or what have you, right? But these three guys, and it's famous up here in Canada. I'm sure many of Americans have watched it too. These three guys, I have seen them out of character maybe 2 or 3 times. So they're in character so much that they, like, Julian is one of the characters' names, is a real person. You know, like, it's so, I've just never not seen him in character. I think that's something that wrestling could do, get back to that, and like really try putting an emphasis on staying in character.
So maybe talk a little bit about what were some of these promotions and what made them distinct from each other.
Okay, so like the AWA, because it was founded by a legitimate, like technical, like a legitimate wrestler, he had a belief that like professional wrestling should be very technical. It should be realistic. The focus should be on the wrestling itself, right? Jim Crockett Promotions, which was based in the South, had they would they would put on a little bit more of a show, but they believed that the focus of the show was the wrestling itself. So it wasn't uncommon for Jim Crockett Promotions to have like hour-long matches, sometimes hour and a half long matches. Ric Flair was famous for doing hour-long matches, which are almost unheard of nowadays. WCCW, which was based in Texas, was pretty innovative in the sense that it was very like high flying wrestling, a lot of moves off the top rope, a lot of like just really fast, like high paced, intense style of wrestling. That's what got them quite famous. Memphis wrestling was basically built around Jerry the King Lawler, and I suggest to people listening to this podcast to look up Jerry the King Lawler, like in his prime. This guy was incredible in terms of like just the reactions he could get out of the audience. He just played such an amazing heel. It was just so funny, and like he could be so mean, and he was just a total blast in the room. And the WWF was at this point with Vince's dad running it. It still always had that flavor of it was like really over the top, more showmanship. Bruno Sammartino was like a strong man powerhouse. So he had like a brawling style, which is what Vince's dad kind of built that promotion around. Yeah, it was more focused on the entertainment part, not as much as it would later become. But yeah, they were more focused on just putting on a circus kind of.
Which in a way is what we probably need. Do maybe, I don't know. Do you think that not having heroes makes us, in what way do you think it makes us more stable?
It depends. It depends on how you view things, in my opinion. Is stability always necessarily a positive? I mean, if you look at when most great art is created, it's usually created in extremely unstable times and wherever the particular artist is living. There's a certain creativity, and there's a certain creativity, a certain sense of horror, a certain sense of the, on a more positive note, the possibilities that can erupt during unstable times. If you just use a recent example, if you look at the intellectual history in between the interwar period between World War One and World War Two, which is about as unstable as a period as you can possibly imagine, it's just rifling off with lots of ideas of possibilities of things that could happen. You have fascism, communism, different types of socialism, all different types of crazy art that seems like it came from outer space. And when you can put it in comparison to what was going on in Europe pre World War One, but then what happened? We got World War Two out of all that. Look at the Reformation as an example. At the end of the Reformation, what did we get? We got the 30 Years' War, which was the most destructive war up until World War One. I think it depends on how you view it. Whether stability just is always 100% a positive, or do we need unstability once in a while?
Well, I think that's probably the question right there is, there's certainly times that you've labeled that times of creative destruction. Would I probably rather live in a stable time where there's enough to eat and I don't have to worry about my kids getting killed in the streets, or my family not living because we can't get food and we're nervous about everything? But like you said, a lot comes out of creative destruction.
Oh yeah, one like most great works of art come during times of hardship. People think it's the opposite, where an artist has it seems like they have a lot of leisure time and to sit and think. But when things are really going well, usually great art is not produced, and you don't have to look too far away. Well, no, you don't have to look that deep. You can just look at something like the Roman Empire when the Antonine dynasty, is that, I believe that's what it's called, right?
Yeah, the five good
Um, the
emperors.
five good emperors. If you look at that time period, especially around like Antonius Pius, there's nothing going on. There's no great art being made. There's not much. And I guess there'll be people who are particular experts in the time period will push back on that. But if you look at the big picture of thing in terms of like Rome creating culture, that's not, they're not creating culture at that point. They're just, it's stable, it's nice, and everything's going fine. Or if you look at early Roman history, when they were creating their culture, it was done in extremely unstable times where they're constantly having to fight wars of survival.
I mean, you can't argue that people who are comfortable in their careers, comfortable in their lives, they're not the ones who are probably going to pick up everything and move to a new place to settle a new area or start a new business or do anything like that. People who are in a good place don't generally want to rock the boat. I don't think that that's some great sociological ground that we're breaking here. I think that that's pretty settled.
Yeah, 100%. Like the domesticity of man, to bring it back to the or tangent about the nomads and agriculture, but it's true, right? We get domesticated and it becomes increasingly difficult to break out of this domestication because it is positive. Like, you know, we have food, we have this, and we have that, and sometimes we need somebody like Mr. Glass to shake us out of this domesticity and bring a little bit of chaos into our lives.
And especially like when the more so, I think when the first RoboCop came out in the late 80s, and by like 92, when the cities are starting, we're getting into that almost, almost in the whole history of the world, historically low crime into the 90s and then the early 2000s and up until fairly recently, just crime levels that were so low. I think people thought that we were going into a new era, but then like, just in recent years, like how, crime is cyclical and it's back again, and these themes start coming up again of how are we policing, how do we want policing, how do we want our cities to run, and it's all kind of blowing up right now. I mean, yeah, and I mean, historically, so many places. I mean, that I think that time period, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around how low crime was. I had read there was, and this might be a good movie too for another movie, that there was a recent Kevin Costner Bonnie and Clyde movie, and I had read a little bit of a biography of the character Kevin Costner played, and I think it was right after the Bonnie and Clyde. So that's like in the 1930s. He became a sheriff of a small town in somewhere in like the Texas, New Mexico border. And this small town had 100 murders a year. And this, I mean, New York City was, I think, at its lowest point in just, it had just a few hundred murders, a city of 7, 8 million people. So I think like you look at those crime statistics, and I mean, everything shows them. They peaked and they went into such a trough. And I think that maybe, because it was such a long time, that was like a generational shift that people aren't comfortable anymore that crime is going to happen, and it's probably going to be a lot more than what we've been accustomed to for the last like almost 3 decades.
Yeah. And kind of like in RoboCop, like in Detroit, it's like this, the crime is just, it's just everywhere, right? Like where I find that's kind of what's happening now, not in the sense that it's everywhere, but like, you grew up, you're around the same age, you're the same age as me, basically. We all knew like certain neighborhoods to not go to, right? Because it was, they were trouble, right? Whereas now, like, you can't, like those that the randomness of this is like spreading out, right? Like it doesn't matter kind of where you are, like it's it's everywhere, right? To a degree. Does that make sense? Like when I grew up in Toronto, it was like you don't go to Regent Park. That was like the thing. Like you don't go to like that's the trouble area. You just stay away from there and you should be fine. Whereas now, like I was just walking down in downtown Toronto and I see, there's a homeless guy walking around with just, carrying a baseball bat, talking to himself. Or I'm like, oh, is this guy schizophrenic or something of the sort, right? Not to like belittle somebody who does suffer from mental illness. It's just, the thing with schizophrenia is they're not really, they can randomly just attack, right? And they're not even really 100% aware of what they're doing, right? He's like holding a baseball bat, like it's just something I didn't when I grew up in Toronto my whole life. I just didn't see that, but now I see it more and more now.